cave, we get another story that's very similar, and it almost makes me think this writer had access to like Roman stories from the Roman Empire. And here's why. So you get a couple pages later, you get to a story about this character named Zul-Qarnain, which means the two-horned one. And right away, my spidey senses started tingling because I know the Alexander Greek romance, and I know all about Alexander, and I know that in not even just the Greek Alexander romance, but in other legends as well as the Neṣḥānā, which is the Book of the Kings in Persian, and Arrian's account. All these accounts talk about Alexander, and they and you know what? Let me show up my screen. I'm going to show his routes that he took. Arrian is writing this, and he's got a geographer with them, and they're drawing a map. And as you can see, this giant mountain range. This is where Alexander the Great is said to have passed through. And you notice how there's you see the two ridges? They say that he passed through those two ridges. Okay, so he's going through two mountain ranges, basically on his way towards India and towards Afghanistan. This is after he leaves Babylon. Basically, his route. Everyone knows Alexander's route. I'm not just making this up. I'm not just theorizing here. This is deep scholarship. We know where he was. He left traces. They wrote stuff. They described stuff on walls, and there's all types of evidence of where Alexander was on his way to India. And the story is that Alexander the Great erected a border between where Gog and Magog is. They are mythological places, but here's where they are according to the Bible. This is according to the Catholic Bible of where the locations of Gog and Magog is. As you can see, Gog's over here, Magog's over here. But a lot of times you'll see in other maps that Gog is Europe. It doesn't really matter where it is. It's beside the point. The point is where this arrow is, where Persia is, and these arrows over here is where Alexander the Great went through, where he erected his border to keep out these barbarians, they call them. And I guess there are people who just weren't civilized. But the main reason why I showed that is because there's a coin, and as you can see, there's clearly horns on his head. So everybody, now this coin was the most used coin in the ancient world. This coin was everywhere. These coins were being used from Europe down to Egypt, all the way to India. This coin was in circulation. This was like the petrodollar back then. Now if you need to trade, you need to use these coins. This is how the Greek Empire got its stronghold on the east. Circulating money and making trade routes, which is why this is what the whole purpose was. So people in an Arabic tongue referred to Alexander as al-Sikander. It's actually Persian, actually. Al-Sikander means defender of the people. So they didn't know his real name. They just had a title for him. But if you look at the coins would show you he's the horned one. So there's really no escaping. I mean, there's no other person in history who built a wall in this location who's depicted as having horns and is known as defender of the people. This is the last thing I want to share. Place of the rising sun, which would be the mountains. If you're in that time zone, you would see the mountains rising up from like this. Now the sun, we know the sun doesn't actually rise. The sun we're revolving on the sun, but the earth is tilted in a way that the poles are like diagonal. So the sun appears to rise like this. So this is what they would see. They would see across the mountains, they see the sun. So the place of the rising sun would have to be the mountains. So it says place of the rising sun, two mountains, Gog and Magog, erects a barrier, and obviously the Quran talks about the one true God, right? Well, here's what the Alexander romance says. Two mountains, God of gods, sole God, he praised God. Northern boundaries, Goth and Magog, which is Gog and Magog. Now tell me, is this not the same story or what? Like, I want to, seriously, how can this not be the same story?
I mean, there's a lot of debate to this and a lot of research about this. There's a lot of disagreement that's emerged over the millennium, over the last centuries. There is some revisionism done. There is actually a theory that may be considered relatively new, that Dur-Karne in the Quran, the two-horned one, may not be Alexander the Great. It may be Cyrus the Great, but it's quite implausible to actually think about that. Okay, Cyrus the Great is depicted or talked of as also somebody who has, you know, two horns on his thing,
I've seen that
helmet,
depiction
whatever
before.
it is.
I've seen that
Yeah.
depiction before.
But it doesn't make sense because there's nothing else that you know, relates that is related to Cyrus the Great in the narrative of the Quran. Whereas there is a lot of connection between the Quranic account of Dur-Karne and the legendary tellings about what Alexander the Great did. Sorry, you wanted to say something?
No, I just want to throw this out there for people who want to accept Cyrus as the horned one. If you're going to accept that he's the horned one, then you also have to accept that he died by the hands of the Magog people, the Mazzagati. The queen of the Mazzagati, Queen Tomyris, cut off his head, King Cyrus's head, and threw it into a wine skin, filled it with his blood, and she said, "Now you'll never have to thirst for blood again." So, if that's his death, then you're saying that Allah, what did Allah do to make him, like, what kind of power, what kind of wall did he build? It didn't work. That's how he died. That's what Herodotus tells us.
There is a parallel regarding Cyrus the Great and Alexander in terms of how both of these people slowly came into, or Alexander slowly was adopted into the Jewish culture as a righteous or heroic guy, whereas Cyrus the Great was already in, you know, prior to that known as a righteous man. Very relevant to the Bible and all that. But with Alexander the Great, it's you have these. Cyrus the Great was to the Jews just known as this guy who is like all about vanity, you know, this big guy who has a thirst for power. But later, over time in Jewish culture, they start adopting him and turning him into a figure who is actually called a righteous Gentile in certain sources. For certain reasons, I can't exactly recall why they import him as a oh yeah, I think the explanation there is that he was so successful, it is not conceivable that God would, you know, let some completely wicked man enjoy these great pleasures of becoming, you know, a ruler of the world. And of course, they then associate a lot of stories, a lot of legends with Alexander the Great, and so do many other cultures. He comes into the Christian culture through the Hellenic traditions and through the Jewish traditions as a culture that people look up to, as a legendary ruler that everybody, you know, aspires to. And different cultures around the world have different accounts about Alexander the Great. We only have very recently found actual accounts of what Alexander the Great actually did, how he lived and all that. But for very many years, immediately after his death, you probably are familiar with this, stories emerged about how great he was. And these stories were like, they greatly varied from story to story, from century to century. They added more and more things to this wonderful character known as Alexander the Great. And one issue is that in many cultures, in many languages, he is described as either as Alexander or as the two-horned one, or the one with two horns. And we even have in certain accounts, in certain texts, mentions of him directly with his name, Alexander the two-horned one, or Alexander was given the name the two-horned one. That's what they explicitly say. So he was given the name the two-horned one, and he asked, and he said, "My name is this and this. Why do you call me the two-horned one?" And so these connections are explained in many sources, and these predate Islam. These predate the Quran, and in the Quran's time, when the Quran was emerging, it would already have been known throughout cultures in Europe, in the Near East, in North Africa, that this character Alexander the Great was a huge, brilliant character who is also called the two-horned ones. What's unfortunate is that people didn't actually know, how he was and the things that he actually did. They just had a lot of legends about him, and they just wanted to make him look like this fantastic, great guy, no matter how. Yeah, because it feels great. And go ahead.
Then you add to the fact that this coin was everywhere, so people would see him every day, whether they like it or not, just by seeing a coin going to the market. The horned one, he's the one that saved us from the barbarians of the north. It just matches perfectly. Now, if it is Cyrus, though, what is the difference? Like, Cyrus wasn't a Muslim; he was a Mithra Mithra worshiper or Zoroastrian. It's hard to tell which one. Those two kind of mesh together. But it's very polytheistic in a way that you have different deities. You have Angra Manu. You have there's all these different deities. I guess you could call them angels or whatever you want, lower deities than the Ahura Mazda. But then there's Mithra, the mediator. This is not Islam. So whether you put him as Alexander or Cyrus, now you have to face the fact that this prophet of Allah was worshiping other gods. Now the whole thing becomes problematic.
Well, Muslim scholars who want to say that this is actually in reference to Cyrus, they kind of distort Zoroastrianism or Mithra or different Iranian beliefs, because they even try to make it look like very frequently that Zoroastrianism is actually a monotheistic religion, but it's not.
No,
it is only what they mean by monotheistic is that you are supposed to worship one superior god, but that one superior god is not the only god that exists. They have a large collection of gods, and one evil god who is at the opposite of Ahura Mazda. But among those, there is not just one god, but you are supposed to worship that one god.
Right.
So that's what their beliefs are. This is very well known, and it has been preserved. So saying that it was him and saying that it was him because of monotheism wouldn't really make sense, because it wasn't monotheism. It would be idolatry. It would be polytheism. It would be
fire worship. People were worshiping, praying to the fire. I mean, this all ties into the whole Kaaba thing, the problems with the Kaaba thing, which we're going to get into in a second. But the Zoroastrian Mithraic religions come from the Vedic line, which is from India and Tibet, where Mithra was like Mithra Varuna. And so if you're going to say that this was a true religion before Islam, then you would have to go back even farther and go to Hinduism as being the true religion in the beginning. So it all just falls apart. And Alexander was just one of the prime definitions of a pagan king. Like his text about him was he was one day worshiping Dionysus, the next day worshiping Ammon in Egypt, and then he was over here worshiping Mithra. There's no way you could say he was a worshiper of Allah. I don't even think anyone tries to make that claim.
He had a syncretic religious worldview that was based on very much what is pragmatic for his goals. It wouldn't make sense to
use the term providence above. So I think if you're going to try to make that into a pre-Islamic, it's like, okay, fine, but now you're basically in Gnosticism now. Now we're just we're just painting brushes over everything. Yeah, that's Islamic. Oh yeah, so is that. Like there's too much problems with that.
As far as I remember, when you go back with the history of Zoroastrianism, as the story goes, I think this is the accepted narrative about Zoroastrianism. It is believed or thought that the character Zoroaster constructs this religion out of his local religion that is already in existence, but he basically turns this polytheistic religion into the religion where you only worship the righteous God who is above everything and who is the light. So this is a religion that comes into existence, into a form of dualism with other gods in an environment where people are polytheistic. So there is no monotheistic origin to that.
No, you're right. You can't escape that.
And so the issue with Alexander the Great, with the Quran, as you said, the Quran explains that this character is called Dur-Karne. People apparently ask about him. They ask Muhammad, according to the narrative, and the Quran then says, then it tries to inform Allah, supposedly tries to inform Muhammad about Zul-Qarnain, the two-horned one, and coincidentally it says things that are just so much in line with the legendary stories about Alexander the Great, such as that he was a great ruler, and Allah gave him so much, and he was a righteous man, and he
2 mountains. That's pretty specific.
Yeah. He went to the furthest west and to the furthest east. In the west, he also saw the sun setting in a muddy spring, by the way.
Right.
And then he went to a people whose language he does not understand.
Thank you. That's the big one. I forgot to mention that one.
Which is something that has been attributed to or connected with Gog and Magog prior to Islam so much, or with stories related to Gog and Magog or people around Gog and Magog so much. And then it says that they were complaining. They were between two mountains, and they're complaining that Gog and Magog are, causing trouble at this and that. So Zul-Qarnain then says, okay, I will build you a wall, I'll just do this now. So he asks them for iron, and then he builds this huge wall to prevent those people from coming through. And the Quran then continues and says that this wall will be in existence for as long as Allah wants it, but one day will come when it will be torn down, and then they will basically pour through and invade all the hills of the world.
Now, this is interesting because there's actually a way to look at this as if it already happened. So this was written, we all know the Quran was written in the 7th century. A couple centuries before that, 2 centuries before that, the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, with the help of Arabs, by the way, the Moors, this was actually part of the people who got together with the Goths to invade Rome. And this is tested by all scholars that the Moors were involved heavily with helping the Goths out. They invited them into Spain and into northern Africa. That's how Alaric was the one who actually invaded Rome. He made the alliance with them at the Moors, and that's how this has all happened. So he goes. So this writer would know this story. This would be Arabic speakers know about the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths invading Rome and taking over Rome, and even the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So I'm wondering now. I can't prove this, but I'm almost wondering if the writer is allegorizing these events, as in this wall was up, then it fell down, and then Allah caused the Eastern or the Western Roman, those wicked Christians to fall because they weren't Muslims.
The problem is, so the Quran tells this whole story. It makes reference to the future, how Allah will bring it down, and then Gog and Magog will invade the world. And to just quickly point out the parallel here, according to the legendary stories about Alexander the Great. Now, there is some dispute about when these stories came into existence and to what time the oldest manuscript refers to, but we have old manuscripts long before the time of Islam where parts of this story are scattered and found, that Alexander the Great, went there between two mountains and built a wall, and that these people were Gog and Magog and this and that. So we already, and that he was known as the two-horned one. We don't have I think scholars are not exactly sure if the story exactly as it is in the Quran exists before the time of the Quran, but there is enough evidence that there are manuscripts that contain several of these details that are mentioned in the Quran in a scattered way. So if you put them together, you have the story that is basically in the Quran as well. Yeah,
that's a good point, because it did get updated and changed, and there are later manuscripts that come after the Quran. And maybe that's, and because the version I have, he says he prayed to the sole God. It almost makes you wonder if they're that's sort of a later addition in translation. So that's interesting.
Yeah, what I know is that Alexander the Great was a great tool for people, and he was utilized by people, by political powers for their own purposes, to kind of say, hey, look, Alexander the Great, whom everyone admires, he did things that we would do, or he was on our side. And then they refer to invaders as Gog and Magog. For example, I think during the time of the Byzantines, the Eastern Roman Empire, they refer to certain hordes from the steppes, from the Caucasians, the Turks, or an Iranian people, several Iranian
Scythians.
people, referred to them as descendants of Gog and Magog, or they associated them with Gog and Magog. And Gog and Magog was basically used as this tool to vilify foreign tribalist people who will come for you and who will have no mercy. And throughout history, Christians associated Gog and Magog with the Huns, with the Mongols, with different forms of barbarians, and Muslims did the same. If you look at Muslim texts in the time of the great Mongol invasions of the Muslim Empire, and the Mongols were so brutal, so strong, so unstoppable, they brought the Islamic Empire to their knees. And there are texts which say that it looks like the Mongols are Gog and Magog. They are coming. It's almost over. Judgment Day will come soon. So this is this thing that they used throughout history.
Oh yeah, and even the Pope would say during the Mongol invasion, they would call death is sweeping through the lands. Like this was it. The apocalypse is coming. and that the Mongols were like the instrument that's going to make it happen, and that was worldwide. That was widespread thought. But you mentioned something that I want to touch on that is really important, because the reason why I think this is in here in the Quran, and this is my own theory, I don't know how much I can prove this, but I think that the writer is trying to capture the minds of the eastern side of the Roman Empire by using these stories about the seven sleepers, about a story that they're even if he's not mentioning Alexander, it still strikes a nerve that they know this story. They're using themes that they would probably respond well to. So when I talk about this on my channel all the time, is that religion is probably the strongest form of propaganda, and it's deadly when it comes to war, because if you can get your enemy, if you can get the people, the main core population of your enemy, to align with you spiritually, emotionally, mentally, it makes it that much easier to go in and conquer those lands, because they're going to fight for you, not them. Mm-hmm. So and this worked. We know this worked because Mehmed II, however you say his name, he's the one who goes and conquers Constantinople, and it seems like they swept through the eastern side of the Roman Empire over the course of many centuries, but they did it very successfully. I mean, they pretty much won all the Crusades. Jerusalem fell, Egypt fell. Egypt fell super fast. All the Arabic-speaking countries, I guess they became Arabic-speaking countries, but all the countries on the eastern side of the Roman Empire eventually fell to Islam, and I think this is part of this had something to do with it. I really do.
Even the first conquest of Jerusalem was too easy.
Yeah,
it was just way too easy. That might have been also because of the constant. I mean, I think it is pretty much proven that the early conquests were very easy for the Muslim forces, because the Eastern Roman Empire had just been at war with the Persians for decades, for so long. They were weakened. The people were sick of war. They had enough of it.
Yeah.
the empires had enough of it, and Islam basically comes right at that moment,
right time. Yep.
Takes advantage of the situation and basically overruns everything, and ironically appears like Gog and Magog.
Yeah, it's interesting. But then you got other stories like Adam and Satan, for example, which is in the Quran. This story as well would be familiar to people of the Eastern, especially in Egypt. Mm-hmm. Now, the reason why I'm bringing up Egypt is there's Nag Hammadi texts that were found in like the 19th, 20th century in Egypt. They're whether you want to call them Gnostic or apocryphal texts, doesn't really matter. I don't really know. Those are all just vague terms anyway. But they're not canon biblical texts. Okay, mm-hmm. What I'm getting at is the story of Adam and Satan was actually an older story, like we've been talking about this entire show, where what was his name, the writer? Justin the Gnostic, not Justin Martyr, but his name is Justin the Gnostic, and he was a writer. He was a Gnostic, actually. Well, obviously the name says Justin Gnostic, but he was writing a story about Adam being presented in front of these 24 archons, he calls them. Now that gets changed into angels later on by the Muslims. But the story was that he gets presented in front of these 24 archons, and Azazel says, "I will not bow to him," and then he gets cast out of heaven. That story sounds really eerily similar to in the Quran, where Adam gets presented in front of Iblis or Satan, and Satan says, "I'm not going to bow in front of him." So you kind of see. And then there's another. Finally, this is the last one I'm going to mention: the baby Jesus, the infancy gospel. We already know this was a story being told in Egypt. That's part of the Nag Hammadi collection. Was Jesus being talking like a grown person as a baby, just like we see in the Quran. Where does he say to Mary? I can't remember what he says.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact words.
But either way,
he starts talking as a baby.
He starts saying something about worship Allah or something like that.
He goes to the she goes to the people, and they are like what the hell is this? What did you do? Why do you have a baby? And then according to the Quranic Narrative, and then she points at the baby, and then they're like, how are we supposed to speak to the baby? And then the baby starts speaking to them, and
right.
It's a very ridiculous story. And these accounts are found in the infancy Gospel of James, I believe. And those sources are by scholarly opinion thought to be they are dated to much later dates than the initial gospels that we have, I think, right? If that's not, if that's not, yeah, I think so. And they weren't included because they seem to heavily deviate from the narrative presented in the original gospels and the
They're
first
heretical.
epistles.
Definitely heretical.
And they contain some very absurd things, which is why they are thought to be just later inventions based on hearsay and based on dramatizations of matters. And the Quran seems to borrow from those books. It borrows those accounts. It borrows the whole baby Jesus speaking as a baby. It borrows a story about turning a clay bird, into a living bird or something like that, I believe. Several other things.
And that's another story that I think is among those non-commodity scriptures. Egyptian Christian. The Coptic church had a lot of weird, like, for example, even the Ethiopian church preserved its own version of the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch has a story of Satan falling too. So that if you kind of put it all together, you can sort of paint a picture of how these ideas were getting spread into the Arabian Peninsula, and they just made it a different version of it and turned it into a monotheistic version, and they just ran with it. And then that's why I'm bringing this. The reason why I'm bringing this all up is because somebody in Arabia, whether it was Muhammad or Abu Bakr, I don't know, all of them together, they put their heads together and said, we can really take over the hearts and minds of people with a religion, and this will be the most. And it worked. It works. It absolutely works, and it's still working today in the world that we live in right now.
Well, there is actually a lot of there's good reason to believe that Muhammad, if he did indeed author the entirety of the Bible, I mean, of the Quran, sorry, if he did indeed reveal the Quran through revelations given to him by Allah through the angel Gabriel, as he claimed according to the sources, then we have good reason to believe that he did indeed try to appease and appeal to Christians and Jews, and he really looked up to them. He praised them as superior to his own stupid polytheistic people. Initially only, of course, initially. Well, first, at the very beginning of the Revelations, he doesn't talk very much about, the Quran doesn't talk very much about Christians and Jews. He doesn't try to talk to them. Gradually, it then turns toward trying to talk to the Christians and Jews and says things like, hey, let's come together and worship one God, and things like that. Over time, his relations with the Jews changed because the Jews seem to just ridicule him and say, hey, what is this? You're just, a con man. And then he gets mad at the Jews, and the Quranic narrative changes drastically into vilifying Jews and hating them and saying that until the end of time the Jews will be the most hostile to you in the world and things like that. Muhammad tries to appease Christians. He can't get what he wants from them. Eventually it turns into vilifying Christians too, and basically saying, hey, if you keep saying that Jesus is God, then you will go to hell and burn there forever, and things like that. But throughout the Quran, there's so much that tries to initially make Christians and Jews like Muhammad and Islam. And we also know by the Islamic accounts that that Muhammad had relations with certain Christians. There were apparently Christians in Mecca where he was born. There were he apparently met Christians a lot on his travels as a merchant. And according to the narrative, when he starts receiving revelations, he goes to his wife, and his wife has a cousin who is a Nestorian Christian, who has converted to Christianity, who has become a Nestorian, and who writes down the Bible or the Gospels in some language, I don't know. And he basically talks to Muhammad and tries to inform him, tries to tell Muhammad that he's a prophet, which is strange by Nestorian standards, but still, that's apparently how the story goes. So, and another thing is, we have certain early Christian accounts. I'm trying to remember the name of the guy who wrote this book, but it's basically directed at heresies. And he says in the book that the southeast, the Arabian lands, are basically full of heretical Christians, who sought refuge in those lands because their beliefs were, shunned and demonized in the regular Christian environment. So it's very likely that Muhammad got a lot of weird Christian stuff that is, very distant from mainstream Christianity in his environment.